We met in the year 2017, 16. One
I
of
think
those
it was
great years.
I think it was 17
17,
because
2017.
yeah.
I was invited to speak at a, a breathe retreat for Eastern Nazarene College. To this day, I actually don't know who that was for, just generally for any student that wanted to get away. Is that what it was?
I believe so.
Yeah. So I just
My memory's
remember,
fuzzy.
yeah, well, what I remember is I'm sitting next to a professor that I was just meeting for the first time, who was part of this retreat in some way. And we were just waiting for everyone to arrive. And you were the first student to come over and just sit, and you just laid your head down. Like it's
Mm.
like you were already in relaxation mode, or you were trying to. I get like my first
Whew.
experience of you was you were exhausted.
Wow. Well, I'm glad I could say I've been consistent.
Well, whether you've been consistent or it's your reaction to a whole bunch of really good reasons for why you'd be exhausted, I wouldn't say that you've always been exhausted in my presence, but that was my first experience of you, that you were just tired.
Mm.
And then I don't know, we must have communicated a little bit. We must have connected pretty well that weekend. I don't really remember. Do you? I don't know whose
I
memory's worse here.
remember a little bit. Well, so I'm trying to remember exactly like the timing of that breathe retreat because I know it was cold, it was winter,
Yeah.
and I know that like was months after I had been to Ferguson
Yes.
for a school trip. And like that's the kind of experience you have where like it just changes you. Like you don't come back the same. And
Hmm.
um the professor who led that trip was a Black man, theology professor. He had already moved on to another school. So like at the time that I was still at ENC in that semester, I was like exhausted and carrying like all like the weight of like all these reflections from my studies with that experience in Ferguson. And then also feeling like I'm just here by myself, just like floating around. And when you were doing the breathe retreat, I remember like hearing you talk and and saying like, oh, finally someone who's saying things that sound it just made sense. Like I wasn't like I just remember like resonating and being like, yeah, I should talk to that guy.
Mm. I'm glad you did. Because
Yeah.
there was one point where I was talking and I said something about Black Lives Matter. Because I mean, this is early 2017, which means we were still in the throes
Mm-hmm.
of Donald Trump just getting elected.
Yeah.
We were in, 2016 was all kinds of wild in this country. Um, and I said something about Black Lives Matter, and your hand, like your hand went up, and the rest of the room was quiet. And I know Christian colleges in particular, especially predominantly white ones, struggle with racism in ways that we'll probably acknowledge a little bit more as we go on. But it was like, oh, okay, you had been quiet the entire time. I hadn't really connected with you. Like when you sat by us, you didn't really say much. So I was curious how you were taking in a lot of this. To be honest, I was watching you because you were, I don't remember how many people of color there. I'm pretty sure it was very few. Um, and so to see that response was like, okay, there's some kind of like connection that was made there. And then we definitely chatted from there on. And then I don't even know, you ended up interning. We built a church together, and
Yeah.
the rest is history, as they say.
The
But
rest is
the
history.
rest is history. But like that connection of you've meant a lot in my life, and like in a pretty significant way, and you've taught me so much. And I think
Mm.
that there's something there's been something that as I've reflected over the last 3 years about not being in church anymore, not being a pastor anymore, the way that things went down at
Mm.
my church, just reflecting on the relationships that have formed me over the last 5 to 10 years. And yours is definitely one that has formed me. So grateful for you in so many ways, and I'm really glad that we are reconnecting.
Yeah, likewise, Dave. I would consider that moment in my life to have been like a very like formative time, and to have met someone like you at that time who just like you believed in me in a way that I hadn't yet believed in myself.
Mm,
And like I hadn't at that point encountered enough like mirrors um and affirmations to name like the ways I was built, the things I'd experienced, what I wanted to do in the world. And you were like you saw beyond where I was at that moment,
mm.
and were able to speak life in ways that I don't know, that just animated me to believe in myself. And I think what's been interesting, yeah, I just keep coming back to I keep coming back to this thing that you said to me in
Uh-oh.
as we are getting through each other, because I think we ended that retreat. The professor you're talking about gave us both a ride back.
That's right.
And I
That's right.
remember, yeah, we stopped at
Okay.
a restaurant,
Okay. Yeah.
and you were saying like, I'm sure they're going to be like churches lining up to like, to have you work for them. And I was like, I don't know if that's true. And it's funny because like you were like the first person who ever said something like that to me, because in my experience, like when I came to ENC, my goal um eventually became to like study religion and to go into the academy. And even though I had done ministry and continued to do ministry during that time, I didn't feel like there was a space for me in a church to do the work that I cared the most about, which incorporated like and centering on justice.
Yeah.
So yeah, I remember being in these classes with these professors, with few exceptions, who like when I would articulate things and be like, "Yeah, I know you're talking about ministry like this, but can we imagine it like this?" And they're like, that's interesting. Never thought about that." And I'm just like,
Oh, mama.
"Okay." And so it was hard to imagine like, "Oh, is there a world where like I could be thinking and doing these things somewhere?"
Mm.
Um, yeah, and so like I felt like through meeting you and like the words that you spoke over me and like the ways that you supported me gave me access to like a plethora of relationships and opportunities to grow and to learn and to like affirm like my giftings. Now I look at myself and I'm just like, wow, like I can't believe this is where I am now, because I like back then I had like no vision of what the future was going to be like.
You know
It
what's
was just
weird?
like I need a rest.
Well, first of all, likewise, same,
Mm,
same. Because you saw me in a way I needed to be seen, and also I remember so many occasions where we would wrestle with what does it look like? Like, what does it look like in a church setting? Because when you're bringing something that's not explicitly like worship music or preaching or just like the standard week to week Bible study thing,
mm,
you're like, no, 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 I want it to matter Monday through Saturday too, in
yeah.
a way that we didn't really experience in church, or apparently your professors in college didn't either. And that imagination was something that I remember us ruminating over a lot. Um, and I wonder,
Yeah.
do you have new ideas about what faith looks like in a way that maybe you didn't back then because you were in the throes of learning it, and like some things
Yes.
connected or didn't connect, which was fine. We always talked about that. Like, this might not be the thing. This might not be the thing.
Yeah.
Do you have new ideas?
Hmm.
It's a
What's
really
interesting
small
is like
question.
a small question, just gonna I've had this like master plan to change the world. I'm just waiting for the right team to come along. And um I think what's interesting is like the things you've named, like leading worship, preaching, like those are things that I know how to do, that I have done
That you're
and I'm
very good
open
at.
to doing. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think like one of the things I've struggled to figure out is like in the midst of all the things that I know I want to do and love to do, like what holds them all together, what drives me, and if anything, like I've always been a philosophically minded person in an exhausted, like traumatized, anxious body that's prone to
Mm.
illness. um, melanin blessed. Um, all of these things influence how I am seen in the world and how I show up. And for the longest time, I didn't feel like I had, and I feel like I didn't feel like I had, and I thought the vocabulary was important in order for me to survive, to find and to name all of those parts of myself
Yeah.
and why, it was significant for me to show up the way I did. And that's what happens when you're in predominantly white space. Like you end up privileging language and being able to communicate the whole of yourself through words over
Wow.
just being. And I think in terms of like the new pathways that I'm finding, like my philosophy is to like create spaces of gentle landing.
Mm.
And like at the time at that breathe retreat, I remember I was going, and like when I was in college, like opportunities to serve were always like they abounded, like it was everywhere. But opportunities to rest, like I had to like literally run away or retreat to rest. Like I had a single room. My philosophy was like, if I'm in my room, this is my space, this is my time. Because like as soon as I leave my room, suddenly like because of my identity and the tools, and also like having the role of a student chaplain at the time, I felt this intense pressure to serve everybody and to be available
Yeah.
to everyone at a moment's notice to carry whatever it is that they wanted me to carry. And
Yes.
so when I went to that retreat, I remember like being asked to do things like, hey, can you lead worship one night? I was like, no, if I'm going to this thing, I'm only going to rest. I will do nothing.
Yeah.
And I could tell that it bothered people. Like
Of
I could tell
course.
like people were uncomfortable with the presence of a black woman resting.
Yeah, for sure.
um,
Well, because you're also
yeah.
supposed to be, especially at that time, you're also supposed to be a face of diversity for the school,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you're
Yeah.
always being used, always being
Mm-hmm.
used up, not
Yeah.
not for your own benefit sometimes, but for the benefit of an institution.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a lot of that.
And you
And
felt it.
I,
I mean, you used to name that. Like you knew it at the time. It wasn't some kind of like, oh, I wonder if they're, you knew what was going on. So for you to choose
yeah.
rest when you knew you needed it, especially because so much of evangelical Christian culture is just about doing it all the time, just like constantly
Mm-hmm.
putting yourself out there to the point of
Mm-hmm.
exhaustion. That was pretty
Yes.
powerful.
And even rest is framed as, oh, like you take a break here so that you can be more productive when
Right.
you are working.
Right.
Like there
Exactly.
is no resting just to rest. Like it has to have a goal of like aiding you in the work that you are doing.
Yes.
Yeah, there
Oh,
was a lot of that.
that's interesting because, yeah, we used to talk about, I don't know if you were there at this point, but we ended up having a series on Sabbath. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and we used Heschel's book. And yeah, we just talked about it from a different vantage point. And we were all trying to figure that out because at most, Sunday was like, you don't go to restaurants, you don't do this or that. It's just like
Mm-hmm.
there's a bunch of attempts at trying to do it in a way that just never felt authentic, or I don't know,
Yeah.
celebrating the Lord's Day. I don't know, but really all it ended up being was like this pause before you go back because you're supposed to get rejuvenated kind of thing. Not rest for the sake of
Yes.
rest.
Not rest for the sake of rest or rest for the sake of reimagining. Like I think
Yes.
about how often, I mean, like for me, reading Heschel's book, and I think you also used, even though I don't think I was there, um, Brueggemann's book as
Yeah.
well,
Yep.
Sabbath as Resistance.
Yep.
Yeah, when I think of what it means to prioritize rest, like rest opens up the space for us to reimagine what our world looks like and what
Yes.
what we have to do. Like I don't know, I saw these memes around like the start of the year where it was like, now I have to go back to work after 2 weeks and I don't remember what I do. Like what do I do? What's my job? Like
It's so true.
and I think like some measure of that is true. Like we should be able to access the rest that we need. So when we return to the things and the routines that we have established for ourselves, we can question them a little bit and be like,
Oh,
why do I do this?
well,
What
that's
is my role? What is
that actually makes me think a little bit more about why you were exhausted. This idea of Sabbath as resistance really resonated with me because I saw and still do in
Mm,
terms of the way that I think about Jesus as a
Mm.
resistance movement. And you had that. Like you were already in resistance mode. You have to be as a Black woman in America, right? So of course you're exhausted all the time because you're constantly in resistance mode, right? Like you're just
Ugh.
resisting the pull to do something that's disembodied, that's, you know, like all about words. The All of that is resistance, and not necessarily with the imagination part able, because you're just surviving. Like, do you
Oh,
feel? No, go ahead. What were you about to say?
I'm thinking about that because one of the things one of the challenges I've tried to center in my studies now in seminary is like, is there a space for Black life beyond resistance? Like, is
Ooh,
there a place for us to exist where our existence isn't tied to the rejection or the objection of something else? Like,
wow,
where do we build our belonging and our being? And
so good.
so, which is why, like, for me, it was important to frame rest as vocation versus as resistance, because I think
Mm,
vocation, like, is about calling, an invitation to dignity, belonging, affirming, and just like naming what has always been and what has never like been able to be conquered and capitalized and like stamped with the conquest of whiteness and white supremacy and all that good stuff. Good stuff,
good
in
stuff
quotation.
in quotes. But
Air quotes.
that becomes the
Um,
challenge, right? Because even in all the institutions that we have been part of, or that you've been part of, it's hard to discern where whiteness is being centered or not centered, because the entire Western world is has a foundation of whiteness through Christian expansion and imperialism.
mm,
And so you've had space now to relearn, reimagine what is not that. So are you able to sort of quickly, in all, and this might have happened before you were in school, but as a white guy, I'm not always able to see that immediately. I have to listen
mm,
to people who are like, no, 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 that's whiteness too.
mhm.
Is it more and more clear as time goes on, where you're like, this is the kind of space we can create that doesn't center whiteness? Like, what does that look like for you now at this stage?
Yeah, I feel like the challenge you've named of the way that the world is framed, like I remember just like reading about Afro pessimism and being like, oh my
Mm,
goodness, is it really that bad? Like, is the world really this bad? And is there really no other alternative and no
yeah.
other way? And
Wow.
I think for me, like what grounds me is to focus on bodies. And like I like Resma Manikin's language of like bodies of culture. Like we're all
Mm,
bodies of culture. And so as bodies of culture, like when we focus on shifting and changing our own actions individually and collectively, we can affect change on a wider scale. And for me, I don't know, it's just been interesting to think, like when I started off learning about justice in ways that framed whiteness, it's always about trying to redeem the ideas, the principles, the policies, and then like practice formation. Like they take like a secondary level, and in fact, like if you can't explain in words why this practice matters,
mm.
you don't like it doesn't legitimize it enough for like people in white spaces of
Right.
justice to like want to move and change things. Like you got to give them the right book. They've got to take 6 months to like let it seep in, and then like maybe 2 years later,
Well, you're
they'll
tapping
do
it.
something different.
You're tapping into something that is triggering a thought in me, that like I've never been much for just reading unless I'm studying.
Mm,
Um, and then I do it well, but I don't do it in my free time because I think I'm an experiential learner more than anything else. I'm like an empath, so I listen. If I'm reading, yeah, I'm like, oh, cool, interesting. I noticed that evangelical culture, at least like intellectual evangelical culture, is all about what you read. That, you know, or just in general. And I think we're
ooh,
noticing that that doesn't change anything. Like it doesn't
mm-hmm,
like move a person in a way that they really like are forced to confront their whiteness or their demons or whatever you want to call it. For me, it's always been relationship. That's like this
mm,
primary mover. I'm like, oh,
mm,
okay. I didn't see that before. Now I see it. And maybe not because I read it, but because I saw it or I listened. I think we had more spaces where that were the case, where white people were forced to listen without, the
Mm,
safety of reading a book in their most comfortable chair. Like what what would that look like is the question. Because that requires us to leave all kinds of assumptions about what it means to practice
mm.
faith or practice community, and be open to just following.
Yeah.
I don't know what
So
that
one of the things I've been,
means, but go ahead.
yeah, it's interesting because like I kind of saw it as like you were like laying out these options for like like
I
build
got
your own plate kind of buffet style things. Um, and let me just pick up from what you've offered.
pick it on up.
make
Yes.
make a plate. Um, and I'm thinking about how like for me like the things I've been trying to reconcile like since even before college, like when I used to do spoken word and
Mm.
like because like writing has always been such like an important thing for me, and so has reading. Like, and something about like if I read a book, like I it's almost like I'm being taught and trained by the person who wrote that book.
Yeah, right.
And I want those words to matter and mean something, and I think that that ties back to like me being a poet. And so being in white space and like witnessing how like words are worshipped in those spaces, uh it does something to you as a writer where you're like, am I contributing to the downfall of civilization? Which seems very intense and extreme, but there have been moments where I'm just like, I want to stop writing because if I keep writing,
Ah,
the people will keep reading and not doing anything.
well, that's the problem,
And
because what you're pointing out is what white people do with it. Because it's like
yes.
that's not who you're writing for or to.
Yeah. So
You,
one of the things I've been working through is like, because my current program is focusing on spiritual formation and like and how like narrative and stories like influence who we become, what we believe, and I just wrote a piece now for for my newsletter that's coming out tomorrow, about like what it means to be a cultural worker.
mm,
And like I got this definition from Elizabeth Alexander, who talks about cultural work as like this space where where the political and like meets community, and it's not separate. And I think so often in justice spaces, like it's so hard to discern like where those things come together,
yep,
because a lot of people know how to talk things and say this is the changes we need to make, but don't know how to build community connections and relationships.
right.
And I've just been trying to figure out like how do I do that, and what is the place of words in that work, because like I can't deny its importance, because the minute that Alice Walker coined her own definition of womanism, she
Mm,
created a community and she created a way that people could access liberation through words. And so words do
yes.
have a place.
Well, words create
And
what
so
is
I
it?
think,
Words create worlds, right? Is that Heschel's quote?
yeah,
His
yeah,
daughter,
I
I
love
believe, said. Yeah,
that.
yeah, you're right.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right,
Yeah.
and I think that as someone who talks a lot, I know words matter. I think
Mm,
it's the over reliance on trying to convince white people about what we need to change through books instead of through
mm,
some kind of connection to like real justice. I just
yeah.
don't think it works. It doesn't work. I mean, it's got to be coupled with. It's not an either or really in the end, but it's an
Mm-hmm.
over reliance upon those things. And I guess I'm curious. Um, uh, it seems like always the case that when we're talking about faith, like you just brought up, faith, politics, culture, all that stuff, they're all seen as separate things for whiteness because whiteness
Mm,
doesn't allow for that stuff. So what you're imagining is the kind of community that is created through just the reality that all of those things are what it means to be human. All of
mm-hmm.
those things, like culture, politics, spirituality, it's all together. And a community that doesn't separate those things is what you're on the hunt for or trying to create.
I would say it's what I'm already a part of.
Yeah.
And like I'm
Yeah.
finding
Say more.
language to name it. Yeah. I I've been really thinking about, I'm always thinking about like the introduction of Gustavo Gutierrez's A Theology of Liberation,
Yeah.
where he says that liberation theology is formed in the reflection on praxis. And so like I've just been thinking like, what does it look like for me to think of words like not just as a space where we dream like what is possible, but where we also can like look back and say like this is what we're doing and this is what you know
Yeah.
like we can use words to describe what we have done, who we have been. um
Yes.
and yes, I have like over the past couple years like formed community in spaces like online and even
Mm.
in school with folks who understand and feel this like same yearning for like rest and newness in spaces outside of um like outside of the oppressions that are supported by the institutions we're a part of.
Mm.
And we just support and love each other, and like most of the times it's just a text or it's just a group chat or it's just like a
Yeah.
hushed conversation in the corner. But like when I think about it, I'm like, this has been church, like this has
Yeah.
been spiritual formation. And like I get to name those things because I'm reflecting on what has happened and what I've done. And I think, I don't know, I think that's how I'd want to live moving forward.
Yeah.
um yeah, it's really hard for me now to be in conversations with people where like when they like tell me what it is that they're doing, it sounds so abstract that I'm like, you're one human. Why are you organizing your life like this? Like one example is like, yeah, I'm starting this blog and it's meant to connect all of the people from this diaspora together and we're going to write this and liberate that. And I'm like, who's we? Like
Who is this way? Right.
like who is this we, who are you connecting with on the ground? And like and how can you, and like it's good to have these aspirations and these dreams, but like I think for me, like as a person who is philosophically minded
Mm.
with the body that I have, I always have to remember how to like um to bridge the gap from like what these transcendent ideas mean and like what the material realities are. And
It's so good.
oh, it's a lot of work. So I take a lot of naps.
You know, it's funny that you say this because I get that question a lot. Like, why do you have a podcast? Like, what's your goal? And then I think,
Hmm.
well, maybe I'm not like a goal person. I never really been that, and I had to be with the church and all that. But now I'm like,
Ooh, people hate that. You don't
I
have any
know,
goals?
I
You have
know.
any aspirations? What are you doing?
I'm like, exactly right. And I'm like, honestly, my answer is like, because I want to, like,
Mm,
because I'm trying to discover what it means to be in community now after church. So like, I fall under, I hate this word and forgive me for even saying it, but the evangelical thing, because I fall under that. Like I typically within
love that
that
word.
is majority atheist. That like
Mm,
most of the people have moved from one place of certainty to another place of certainty. I still say I'm a person of faith who's been deeply formed by the life and teachings of Jesus as I understand them. That is my
mm,
sentence for how I express faith, and this is an avenue to try to figure out what that looks like in the world. That's it.
mm.
Like I'm not trying to build an empire here. I'm not trying to like figure out what the next thing. Like I'm just doing a podcast cuz like it's we talked about this, like it's a great way for me to have community. And so
Yeah.
that's why I do it. And I think that there's, when you talk about those kinds of aspirations, when someone writes a book and they're like, I'm going to change the world for Jesus, it's like, well, I don't know, maybe. I don't know. Like, so
Yeah.
if you're a writer, okay, so
Mm,
if you're writing something, which you do a lot, and I please, you have a Substack, you have your newsletter, everyone should, get on
mm.
those. When you're writing, do you have a goal? Is it like, is there something that you're trying to accomplish that's outside of just this is an expression of Rose J. Percy? What's going on for you?
I think mostly it's just an expression of Rose J. Percy.
Yes.
It's really, and
Yeah.
I think I've had to give myself permission to let it be that.
Yeah.
And I've had help from friends along the way. Like one of my best friends, Carla Mendoza, is an Afro-Peruvian woman living undocumented in the US.
Mm.
And she says, when I write to Carla Mendoza, an Afro-Peruvian woman who's on, like, she writes
Oh,
specifically to herself.
that's so good.
Um, and through like learning from her and others who have felt their experience, who have seen how the ways that their experience hasn't been named or prioritized in other spaces or writings, like to be able to add your voice in a way that invites abundance where there's scarcity is like beautiful. So that's
Mm.
pretty much it. Like I write to affirm myself, and I write to I express a truth about the world, or my world, my perspective. And I write to invite. I remember like when I used to blog, I felt like there was like this pull to write because I'm like convincing someone about something. And then I had to pause and like stop doing that for a while because I'm like, who am I writing to? And that's a
Yeah.
question I always center in my writing, like who am I writing to
Mm.
and with? Because I also believe, at least with my newsletter, I write to the community of folks who read it and who are seeking gentle landing.
Mm.
And so the ways in which I prompt them is always to point them back to themselves and offer a space of reflection. Because like the last thing I want, and I think I have had to learn from doing ministry with you and others, is that I don't ever want to set up a system of spiritual care that depends on me,
Oh,
solely on me. And I think that has been like one of the ways I've liberated myself from setting things up that way is, yeah, inviting people with questions and also offering the questions that I ask myself. So, yeah.
I love that. But people are looking for someone to look to, and you're one of
Yeah.
those people. And I do think, as someone who's blogged, who's podcasted, who started a church, and who's always been up front, like talking and writing, there is this sense that I always have, that I'm trying to make sure that I understand myself and that I
Mm.
communicate clearly what matters to me. And sometimes I'll put something out there that gets like very little in terms of resonance or something like that, but I'm super proud of, because I'm like, yes, I
Mm.
expressed that thing exactly the way I wanted to, you know? And,
Yeah.
and that
Mm-hmm.
feels good when you don't have to do it. When it's not like,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
not your job, right? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I just recently like changed things up on my newsletter because there are a lot of people starting Substacks right now,
Are they?
and there's a boom. Like, and I think it can be good. It can be a space where if we're intentional about it, we can uplift voices that would not have the opportunity to publish anywhere else and things like
Mm,
that. But for me to set it up so that it's not, I don't know, that I don't, so I don't feel like I'm like part of this machine. Like I just said, okay, everything I post is free and you can
yeah,
access new posts for up to 2 weeks. And then after that, it's archived. And if you want to see the archive, you can pay for it.
you
Like
paying.
that's,
Yeah.
that is the setup. And I will post when I want and when I feel like it. Um,
That's so good.
and yeah, with social media, it's a little bit harder because like the way I think about it is like, despite the fact that in a lot of ways, like being a spiritual entrepreneur
Mm,
like means like, yes, I get to to work for myself or something like that. I work when I want and I have set hours. Social media in a lot of ways is a connector to people who can reach out to me and things like that. But the
yeah,
ways in which the algorithms are set up and the obstacles that are, in the way of your stuff getting to the right people,
yeah.
it becomes a boss. Oh, you think you're your own boss? No, actually you work for all these platforms that host your things.
Exactly.
Surprise.
You've got to figure out a way to make them be like, "Oh, this is worthy of putting out to a larger
Right.
audience." Yeah,
Surprise, surprise. The gig economy is still part of the other economy, and
exactly.
capitalism is still real. And
Yep.
maybe, sure, you can buy the 4 Hour Work Week by Tim, whatever his last name is. But, but at the end of the day, you're working 24 hours and you're not resting, and you're and
Y-
you're
you know,
you're
the
stressed about the future.
yeah, all of the things. Like
Yeah.
it's hard enough to
Yeah.
just be human. Never mind to take a community of people's burdens on your shoulders, which is some
Mm.
you know, it makes me
Hmm.
think about this weekend. is and Martin Luther King weekend. Okay, so it's like Martin Luther
Oh,
King Day tomorrow,
yes.
right? So as a civics teacher, I spent a good chunk of time talking about him, and my kids learn about him in school. Obviously, all they learned about was the "I Have a Dream" speech, but like as we know, America has co-opted a person that they hated and turned him into a hero. They did that instantly with him. Um, what I'm curious about with you is that like this civil rights movement, a lot of the movements around justice, especially for Black folks in America, is a never-ending struggle, or it can seem that way, right? And as someone who feels that on a in your body and who feels it as a participant in movements to bring about justice, um, how central, like, what do those rhythms look like for you? Because, like Martin Luther King, they said he had the heart of like a 60 something year old when he died in his 30s. These people that are just living, breathing, fighting all the time. Like,
Yes.
what does that bring up for you now?
Yeah. I think since the beginning of our time working together, my main concern and questions were always around the well-being of those who fight for justice in the world and who are caretakers, community, justice workers or things like that. And so and we had a lot of people like that in our church. So like we were always thinking through like we are here to create a space where like you're empowered to go back out and do the work you do and find the rest you need. And so I think that still carries on
Mm.
in the ways I do my work or hope to do my work.
Yeah.
And yeah, I got to study Dr. King in a class, like study his leadership. And I think when you study King in depth and you know the things that influenced him in the making of his life, you realize um like it really wasn't about him. Like it wasn't about. And what is interesting of like with what we do with history,
Mm.
like we've created narratives, and those narratives inform stereotypes that are continually harmful to Black bodies,
Mm.
and like positioning King as this like messiah figure.
Yes.
You know, a lot of people who do justice work assume that they must take on that kind of role, and that's because of how we've told the story in a way that
Yes.
centers him, and we lose sight of the community that helped create him and the ideas that informed him. And I think about
Mm.
the place of like Howard Thurman in his life, like when he experienced his first life-threatening moment with someone like stabbed him with a letter opener or something. He was
Yeah.
in the hospital and he almost died. The doctor told him if he had sneezed, he would have been dead.
Oh
Like that.
God.
Yeah, it was really bad.
Wow.
And Thurman visited him in the hospital and said, "You need to take a break. You need to take some
Mm.
time and rest." And he did. He took a little bit of time off,
Mm.
and it was in that time off that he wrote like where do we go from here, from chaos to
Mm.
community. um like that space of rest allowed him to reimagine and to move forward with something that like could at least begin to ask questions beyond his life, like for people to reach to, because he was always conscious of the fact that he could die at any moment. So it's
Yeah.
just interesting to me how we lose so much um, in centering the wrong things. Like, you know, but
Yes.
yeah.
No, that's good.
Mhm.
He was very much, anytime you see writings of his or interviews, he's always pointing to other people, in a
Mhm.
way that's like, this is not about me. But what you just said made
Mhm.
me think of James Baldwin, who moved to France, as a
Yes.
gay Black man who was a prolific writer, um,
Mm.
well-known voice in the movement. Was like, I'm not safe here. I'm going to take care of me,
Yes.
you know, and I'll
Yeah.
participate on my terms.
Mhm.
And I think that's
Yeah.
powerful. Yeah.
Even on a contemporary level, like Ta-Nehisi Coates
Yeah.
leaving Twitter, and I mean he's still, you can still access his writings in a number of places. And in fact, I think I have like an Amazon alert that like lets me know whenever he publishes something, and he's
That's awesome.
always publishing
Yeah.
something. And he was just like, yeah, I just feel better like when I'm not there in that space where
Mm.
everyone is criticizing everything about you. And your body is wired to react to things in ways that are like harmful for at least like regulate like self-regulating your emotions and your nervous system.
Hmm.
Like so he doesn't do social media, and he found his own way to like create rest in his life so that he can and I don't want to frame this as like rest and as a pathway to being more productive, but I
Yeah.
think rest helped
Right.
him to reimagine the work that he does do, and that's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the people that are the most mo- that inspire me the most are in some way disconnected from the machine, right? You know, if
Mm,
I think about church history, you've got Martin Luther, who
mm.
challenges the imperial state, but he becomes his own imperial state, very problematic. And then you got the Anabaptists who are like separate, who are just like, we're not pledging allegiance to anybody. Those are the people that I'm always like, where's that group? Who are just like distant enough, but just are able to speak into the truth of the system. That's
Yes.
that's always what I'm sort of trying to find. And there's so many voices. There's just so many
Yes.
voices. Like,
I have to give a shout out to my girl Julian of Norwich.
let's hear it.
Yes, Julian of Norwich. I mean, I remember reading about mystics and Christian tradition classes and just being like, yeah, yeah, whatever. Like these people that like went off and like thought of like you can't overlook like the effects of asceticism and harm of the body as a way of spiritual, finding
Right.
spiritual um I don't know. And yeah, you can't overlook that stuff.
No.
But there's something beautiful about like the ways that the mystics, and we still have mystics today. I identify as a mystic, and
Mm,
like to create that space to encounter God outside of a system, and to what I love about Julia of Norwich is the way that she writes about God's love
mm,
in a time where the church, they had like, I'm not sure, my timeline might be off, but like the Catholic Church, like in like indulgences might have been happening around that time. But there are
yeah.
ways that in order for you to access freedom liberation, you had to do it through this institutional structure that they've set up. And
Right.
she's like, she felt like for her to write about it, like she was risking something. But as she wrote, she's like, I'm writing this because I feel like this is what God is calling me to write.
Mm,
And um and I don't say it lightly that I feel like I have personally had a vision of God showing me how deep and great his love is for us.
mm,
And and she would like describe God's love as like this like hazelnut enclosure, like enclosing around us, protecting us and keeping us safe.
mm.
And like the phrase like all will be well, all manner of things will be well, like she was writing during um, you know, not only was she in self-isolation, but there was like a pandemic happening around her. And
Yeah.
she's in the space where people are looking for hope. And what the hope that she does find is this hope that wasn't necessarily endorsed by the institutions of the time. And I just think about how so often um, the language of certainty
Yeah.
and the language of like doctrines, creeds, and things like that help support institutions. And that's why we have wars of people fighting over the legitimacy and supremacy of their ways of being.
Right.
And like mystics and contemplatives, like I firmly believe like that those who are committed to a role of discerning, what is true, what is deeply true, aren't disconnected from the world, but they are deeply connected in understanding of that reality that we all face.
Mm,
Um, yeah.
mm.
And so when I think of like someone who like does that, I think of Julian Norwich, I think of Howard Thurman,
Yeah.
and I have other friends that I'm in contact with who do similar things where it's like when we are saying these things that we believe is so deeply true about the divine, you know, the divine and what is true about love and justice and peace, like it will challenge these systems,
Yep.
and it will challenge the legitimacy of the certainty that so many of us are fighting for in violent ways.
Mm.
But it's all out of love, and it's all with like a deep understanding of the risks involved with naming those truths. Like
Yes.
it's wild.
Yeah. Well, uh, understanding of love is to, people will always say, I'm a lover, not a fighter, but to love
Mm,
is to fight. Like you're if you're a lover, you're a fighter, and that's what you're doing. And everyone's fight looks different. Your fight looks different than
Whew.
you know Ta-Nehisi Coates' fight. It looks different than my fight. We are all of our fights look different. But if if you find yourself in a place where your gut reaction is to protect a system,
Mhm.
even if it's something that means something very very deep to you, like Christianity has found itself in this place of constantly trying to protect itself from the onslaught of people who have named injustices. And
Mhm.
what really it comes down to is like just acknowledging that it sucks, like that we did bad things, that like there's
Mhm.
been really bad stuff and continues to be bad stuff. What's the harm in saying, yeah, that's the case? Like there's no perfect institution. We want to be a part of doing justice, so let's name
Yes.
those realities. um I can't help but notice you got a Licol. Your shirt says Licol. Is there anything else it says on there?
It says l'église, l'école, la caille, which
Ah,
is all Haitian kids know those are the three places you're allowed to go: church, school, and home.
I remember you saying this term to me when we were working together. Did you get this shirt made or did you find it?
No, I found it. I found it online, and it just made me laugh, so I had to buy
the,
it.
the Haitian part of you is something we haven't discussed yet. And
Mm,
just how much that experience of the world being I mean, you were born in Haiti, correct? Or were you born
yes.
here? I mean, the child of Haitian immigrants. Your experience is formed by that. It's not, it's a major part of who you are.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
and how that puts you in the conversation, the American conversation. This like
Mm,
is a different space, And what is that like? What does that look like for you? It sounds like you've got friends from all kinds of experiences. You said the woman that is deeply inspiring to you that you're connected to is
yeah.
Afro-Peruvian. Is that what you said?
Yep.
It's so what does that
Yeah.
kind of look like? Is there a shared experience that you resonate with, that you all connect to, or is there something that you each sort of appreciate about each other that's like that curiosity that invites
Mm,
community and movement toward justice?
hmm. Well, I mean, I feel like there are definitely like lots of different labels I feel connect different people in my life to me.
Hmm.
Um, and in terms of being Haitian American, like I think about a lot like the fact that like I was born in Haiti, but I came here well before I could understand why we were coming here.
Yeah.
And so I had to form an understanding of myself, that which like the earliest iteration of it was like please your parents, make this journey worth it.
Wow.
Find success, navigate these systems in a ways that you can preserve your culture, but also negotiate parts of yourself to survive in these spaces. And so
Hmm.
I think part of what I've learned and what I continue to try to learn is like how to hold all of the differences in me, like without um I don't know, without feeling like I have to let anything go. And I think one of the things that I felt like I had to do in white spaces was like I had to like turn up certain parts, turn down other parts. Like it's like always constantly moving around with like this soundboard where like you mute mute your black scent here,
Wow.
turn up your code switching here. Like you do all these different things to like EQ to the right environment. And
Wow.
yeah, I think one of
No
the things
wonder you're
I've
exhausted.
I've learned, right, it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
um one of the things I'm trying to find my way back to what I call creolization. um
Ooh.
no, not this I call creolization, but I get that term from Edouard Glissant, who was a Martinican philosopher.
Mm.
And like as you know, Haitian Creole is a mixture of like French and Spanish and African languages. um Like
Mm.
there's bits of indigenous words that survived in there. Like it's a
Wow, I didn't know that.
conglomerate of things.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting is like it's set up to be like the because of colonization and the standards, Western standards, French is set up to be the national language, and Creole is kind of like what you speak at home.
Yep.
You know, it's like where you speak casually or whatever. Like, and so a lot of Haitians don't even know how to read Creole because it's like it's just a spoken language to so many people.
Yep.
And what I love about learning about Creole and Creolization from Glissant and like ways I've adapted it for myself is that like within Creole is evidence of cultural memory,
Mm.
survival, beauty, like even like the violence of the language of words merging together, blending, and refusing to stay still and refusing to be pinned down. Like that's the beauty of Creole is that it like he talks about creolization as like this like there's this like freedom to move from the margin to the center like and continually confuse and like I just love that stuff like I just
Oh,
get like ooh my
I
I
know.
get in my nerdy
Well, I guess I
nerdy
do
pocket
too.
like oh my gosh.
I guess I do too because I
Yeah,
just got
so
chills while you were saying that. I love
yeah,
that.
so
That
that's what I want to live. And I didn't get to the language of creolization without getting through like an embrace of liberation theologies, but also like theopoetics, which is like the space that holds a respect for the ways that theology is lived in our bodies and in the unsaid and in the creative. So yeah, there's a lot of beauty there. But at least when I approach identity in the sense of my sense of an identity, like I think before it would have been, and then the evangelical framework is like, what's your story?
yeah.
And your story always has to end with like this, like everything's perfectly tied together and who I
Yeah.
am now and the purpose and my walk and my walk, and like all those things have to make sense for that moment where you and this person are bonding over coffee at the whatever
Yeah.
coffee shop in town. Like it has to like and what I've learned is like
Wow.
I don't have one story. I have stories. And sometimes I don't even have stories. I have a page with 3 words on it, and that's a poem. Like and
Hmm.
learning to embrace this reality that like the ways I can form an understanding of my identity can exist outside of this like story structure that leads to a perfect conclusion every time has just been liberating. So yeah, I think like when it comes to what it means for me to be Haitian American, to be a black woman in the U.S., like I don't, I do not live with the express goal of trying to reconcile what all these different experiences mean in one conversation.
Why? We were supposed
Period.
to wrap it up. We were supposed to wrap it up today. Rose. We were supposed to figure that all out. Ah, I think that is like what makes you an artist, you know. You
Mm,
the like you Rose, but you in general, a person, an artist is someone
mm,
that's endlessly curious about themselves and the way that they
mm,
experience the world. Like you
mm.
seem to like as a mystic, that's like curiosity is an essential component of what it means to be a mystic.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
to wonder about who am I now is not just like one answer. you know,
Mm-hmm.
it's influenced by 5,000 different things. And I think
Yeah.
that's beautiful the way that you just described that. Like, I don't know, it's always evolving. Everything's evolving. The
Mm-hmm.
conversation we have now
Mm-hmm.
will definitely be different 20 years from now. It'll be different tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a
Yes.
beautiful thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now you're to wrap things up neatly, Rose. Um, no, actually, now as someone who's finishing up a second master's degree, you're
Mm-hmm.
writing. There's probably a lot of wonder happening for you right now, like a lot of
Oh yeah.
curiosity. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is something that you sort of are wondering about as you traverse this new path ahead of you?
Well, it's hard to say I could narrow down just one thing.
You're supposed to because that's
Oh, yeah. 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 At least in this moment, I'm always wondering, I'm like when I look out into the world, my eyes are always looking for beauty and trying to illuminate and make sense, not make sense of, but like illuminate and fill my life with beauty in this way that feels good.
Mm,
And yeah, so yeah, I decided that that's a better motivator for me in my studies and in the work that I do than anything else. Like, I'm not really motivated by money, although I need it to live. Please pay me if you can. Subscribe to that newsletter.
amen.
I
Amen.
need it to live, but I write that newsletter because, like, I'm trying to capture these moments of beauty and share them with people and to reveal the beautiful. Um, and like so much of the justice frameworks that I've inherited, for me, like they're groundless if we don't consider like why did that person feel motivated to write that, like why did it matter that we live this way or do this thing, and it's and like comes back to these visions of beauty. So in my wonder, one of the things I practice to support my wonder is reading poetry, and I also have this collection of that I love called Black Imagination, curated by Natasha Marin, and it's just like, if anything, like it is the post 2020, post George Floyd, post I don't want to say post BLM because I want to believe that BLM is, it extends beyond just an organization and a
Yeah,
moment.
for
But it's
sure.
definitely post a moment, like, and it captures a feeling that so many Black people feel right now, which is like exhaustion, fatigue, overstimulation, and in that weariness and racial fatigue. Like she asked these three questions, like, imagine a world where you are safe, valued, and loved, and how do you heal yourself? And there's another question, but that first one means a lot to me. And in that asking, like the collection is like people responding with essays and poems, and some are saying, this is what I imagine, this is what I see, and some are saying, I can't even imagine that, this is my reality.
Mm,
And to be have a collection that respects like the spectrum of leaning into hope or embracing an understanding of criticism, cynicism, and criticizing the world, like holding all of that is just so beautiful. And so, as much as I can, I don't know, I want to lean into more of that, making space to ask those kinds of questions. Imagine a world where you're safe, valued, and loved. And if we can answer that question and dream up a response, maybe we could live it. Maybe we could have that world.